I moved into the neighborhood with a mixture of excitement and relief. After years of bouncing around cramped apartments and noisy urban blocks, finally owning a house in a quiet suburban community felt like a dream come true. It was a modest home, nothing extravagant, but it had what mattered most: space for me and my grandmother, who had come to live with me after her arthritis made it difficult for her to live alone. The neighborhood was peaceful, the streets lined with mature trees that swayed gently in the breeze, and the neighbors all seemed friendly enough. It was the kind of place where kids rode bikes to school and folks waved as they watered their lawns. I wasn't looking for trouble. I just wanted a little peace and to keep my family safe and comfortable. For a long while, that's exactly what I got. My grandmother and I settled into our routines: morning coffee on the porch, weekend barbecues, and quiet nights watching old movies. She loved tending her garden, and I'd spend weekends restoring my pride and joy. A 1970 Chevelle. It was my passion project, a classic muscle car I had rebuilt from the frame up. The glossy red paint gleamed under the sunlight, chrome shining like it belonged in a museum. It wasn't just a car to me. It was a labor of love, a connection to my late father who had introduced me to car restoration when I was a kid. Every detail was perfect, down to the original leather seats, the engine roaring with the kind of power that made heads turn. I kept it safe in my garage, locked and hidden from view. It was private property, after all. For a while, the neighborhood and the HOA, short for Homeowners Association, didn't interfere much. The HOA was just a quiet administrative body that kept the community clean and organized. But everything changed when Rick Withers got elected president of the HOA board. Rick was a man who seemed to relish power. Tall and stern-faced, he carried himself with the kind of self-importance that immediately set off warning bells in my head. Within weeks of taking over, he started rolling out a series of new rules and regulations that made it clear the HOA's role wasn't just to maintain common spaces, but to control the lives of residents in ever-increasing detail. The old relaxed community atmosphere gave way to a more suffocating environment where every step you took seemed watched and judged. Rick's first moves were subtle, but disturbing. He introduced stricter rules on landscaping: no more bright flower beds or vegetable gardens that didn't match the neighborhood aesthetic. He imposed fines for garbage bins left out for more than 24 hours, even though city rules allowed for longer. Then came the parking enforcement notices. Overnight, cars that didn't fit Rick's vision of the community were being flagged. Unapproved vehicle aesthetics, he called it in the notices, targeting anything that didn't look like the typical family sedan or minivan. That included lowered cars, custom paint jobs, and classic cars like mine. I received my first letter one morning, a polite but firm warning that my car did not conform to the community's standards and that further violations could result in fines. I was stunned. My car was safely tucked away inside my locked garage. It wasn't on the street or blocking anyone's view. How could it possibly violate any rules? I went to the HOA meetings to ask, but Rick brushed me off with a vague explanation about maintaining property values and community harmony. The rules, he said, gave the HOA the right to regulate vehicles, even those kept on private property, if they impacted the neighborhood's appearance. The very idea felt absurd. My car wasn't visible to anyone except me and my grandmother. It was clean, silent, and stationary. But Rick had made up his mind. To him, the Chevelle was a symbol of rebellion, a challenge to his carefully crafted image of the neighborhood. I ignored the notices, thinking they would blow over. But Rick didn't let up. Soon, fines began arriving, each letter more threatening than the last, demanding hundreds of dollars for continued violation. I was livid but held my tongue. I paid the fines reluctantly, hoping to avoid confrontation, but inside, I was seething. As the weeks passed, Rick's harassment intensified. I noticed him hanging around more frequently, sometimes parked across the street in his SUV, watching my house with a cold, calculating gaze. My grandmother noticed too. She warned me not to trust Rick and to keep a close eye on the house. I agreed but felt powerless. What could I do against someone who wielded HOA rules like a weapon? I contacted the local police department to ask if Rick had any legal authority to fine me or inspect my private property, but the officers were polite yet unhelpful. HOA disputes are typically civil matters, they said. You might want to consult an attorney. That advice gave me little comfort. I wasn't wealthy or connected enough to hire expensive legal help. Meanwhile, the HOA board, packed with Rick's supporters, rubber-stamped every new enforcement measure he proposed. The community seemed divided between those who supported the strict order Rick promised and those who quietly resented his overreach but feared retaliation. Rumors spread of neighbors receiving similar fines for trivial infractions. Flower beds deemed too colorful, lawn decorations labeled offensive, even holiday lights taken down prematurely. The neighborhood, once a haven, felt like a cage. One afternoon, I returned home to find a bright orange sticker plastered on my front door. The sticker bore the HOA seal and a terse message: Notice: scheduled inspection of garage and property for compliance. I stared at it, disbelief turning to anger. Who gave them the right to inspect my garage? That was private space, behind locked doors, not common property. I called the HOA office, but the receptionist was evasive and instructed me to comply with community standards. No further explanation was given. It felt like an intimidation tactic designed to unsettle me. Grandma, ever pragmatic, didn't mince words. She had lived through war, hardship, and the constant threat of invasion in her youth. Now, at 82, she might have been small in stature, but her spirit was ironclad. That evening, she sat me down in the living room, her sharp eyes meeting mine. "They're not going to stop, kid," she said. "This isn't about rules. It's about control. Rick wants to break you to show you who's boss. We need to be ready." She surprised me by pulling out a box of old equipment from her bedroom closet, a collection of gadgets, cameras, motion sensors, and even a few non-lethal self-defense tools she had kept from her days in military intelligence. "We're not giving them the satisfaction," she said firmly. "This house is ours, and so is that car." We spent the next days installing discrete cameras inside the garage, motion detectors around the perimeter, and loud alarms that Grandma insisted on testing relentlessly. She set up signs in the yard, tasteful but clear warnings that the property was under surveillance and that trespassers would be prosecuted. Grandma even wrote a little note on a placard for the garage door: "Trespassers will be greeted by Grandma. You won't like it." I laughed at first, but the more I thought about it, the more it felt like the perfect message. It wasn't just about the car anymore. It was about standing up to tyranny. Despite our preparations, Rick did not back down. I could feel his gaze on us every time I left the house. The community meetings became battlegrounds where I challenged his authority and demanded transparency. But Rick was slick. He twisted rules, silenced dissenters, and framed his vendettas as protecting community values. Some neighbors cheered him on. Others avoided taking sides. I knew it was only a matter of time before he tried to take more direct action. The Chevelle was a trophy to him, a symbol he wanted crushed. One late night, as Grandma and I sat reviewing security footage, we spotted a shadow moving near the garage gate. It was Rick carrying bolt cutters. I felt a chill run down my spine. He was escalating. The quiet neighborhood we loved was turning into a war zone. Grandma's voice broke the silence. "You ready for what's coming?" she asked. I nodded, heart pounding but determined. We weren't going down without a fight. This was our home, our family, and our freedom. And Rick Withers was going to learn that some battles are better fought with more than just rules and threats. From the moment Rick Withers stepped into his role as the HOA president, his obsession with control escalated beyond the letters and the fines. It was one thing to send threatening notices and bully people into compliance through paperwork. It was another entirely to physically show up at my property and behave like some sort of neighborhood cop with delusions of grandeur. The first time I noticed Rick pacing near my driveway was on a muggy Tuesday evening. I had just gotten home from work, tired and looking forward to relaxing with Grandma, when I spotted him. He wasn't driving by or just casually walking past. No, Rick was lingering. He was clutching a clipboard tightly, his eyes darting around as if he were inspecting my property line. Every few minutes, he'd jot something down in his little notebook, making notes with a scowl that seemed permanently etched on his face. I watched from behind the window blinds, my heart pounding with a mix of frustration and apprehension. What was he looking for? Why was he making a point to scrutinize my driveway like it was a crime scene? It wasn't long before these visits became routine. Rick showed up at all hours, sometimes early in the morning before the sun was fully up, other times late at night when most of the neighborhood was asleep. He never came alone. His inspection tours, as he called them, involved other HOA board members or a handful of volunteers who seemed eager to please him. They traipsed around the neighborhood with clipboards and cameras, taking photos and writing down violations. I started to notice their strange habit of hovering near my house, sometimes standing just out of view but close enough to be intimidating. I could feel their eyes burning holes into the walls of my home, silently judging every inch of my property. That's when I decided to install security cameras. If Rick wanted to watch me, I would watch him right back. I ordered a set of high-definition cameras with night vision and motion sensors, strategically placing them around the house. One pointed at the driveway, another on the side gate, and a couple more aimed at the garage doors. Grandma helped with the installation, even climbing ladders and holding wires steady despite her age. "This isn't just about the car," she reminded me, tightening a screw on the mounting bracket. "It's about keeping our home safe." Once the system was up and running, I felt a little more secure, knowing that every inch of my property was now under watch. But that security came with a strange new tension. Sometimes, when I reviewed the footage, I'd notice gaps where the recording abruptly stopped for minutes at a time. Strange glitches? Technical malfunctions? Or something else? One night, as I sat watching the live feed on my laptop, the screen froze. The timestamp blinked out, and the feed cut off just as a shadow moved near the garage gate. My pulse quickened, and I rebooted the system only to find the footage from that entire hour missing. I frowned, the unease creeping up my spine. I knew what that meant. Someone was tampering with the cameras, trying to erase any evidence of their presence. The paranoia set in like a thick fog. I shared the footage with Grandma, who narrowed her eyes, her military training kicking in. "This isn't random," she said grimly. "Someone wants to hide their tracks." We reviewed the footage frame by frame, noting every suspicious movement, every gap in recording. The next day, I went down to the local police station to file a report. I wasn't naive enough to think they'd deploy officers to guard my property 24/7, but I hoped they'd at least take the interference seriously. The officer behind the desk listened to my story and glanced at the footage on my phone. He nodded politely but gave me the standard line: "HOA disputes are usually civil matters. Unless there's clear evidence of a crime, it's hard for us to intervene." I pressed for more, explaining that someone had deliberately tampered with surveillance equipment, which I believed was illegal. He shrugged, sympathetic but unwilling to escalate the situation. "We recommend keeping records and reporting any direct threats or break-ins." Feeling helpless, I left with a sense of frustration bubbling inside me. The system that was supposed to protect me felt powerless against Rick's creeping tyranny. Then came the day I returned home to find something new, something that made my blood run cold. Stuck firmly to my front door was a bright red sticker with the HOA seal boldly stamped on it. The words were clear and official: "Notice. Scheduled inspection of garage and property for compliance." My hands trembled as I peeled the notice off and read the fine print. The HOA demanded access to my garage and all surrounding property to ensure compliance with community standards and vehicle regulations. I reread it twice, disbelieving the audacity. My garage was private property, secured behind a locked door that only I and Grandma had keys to. No HOA had the right to demand entry. I immediately called the HOA office to protest, but the receptionist was cold and evasive. "It's standard procedure," she insisted. "You need to cooperate." I told her it was illegal and an invasion of privacy. She hung up. That night, Grandma and I sat in the living room, the house quiet except for the ticking of the old clock on the mantel. She looked at me with those piercing eyes, the ones that seemed to hold decades of secrets and battle scars. "They're going to try something," she said quietly, her voice steady but ominous. "You can't let them walk all over you. We have to be ready." Then, with a surprising burst of energy, She disappeared into her bedroom and returned with an old duffel bag. "Let me show you what I've kept tucked away all these years." She pulled out a collection of gadgets that looked like something out of a spy movie: small cameras, motion alarms, flashlights, and even a taser, polished and intimidating. "This was all standard issue back in my day," she said, her eyes twinkling with a mix of nostalgia and determination. "If they think they can sneak in and take what's ours, they've got another thing coming." For the next several days, we fortified the house. Grandma rigged motion sensors near the garage and side gates. She set up extra cameras inside the garage, hidden in corners to catch anyone trying to tamper with the car. On the walls of the garage, we hung signs that read, "Warning, property under 24/7 surveillance. Trespassers will be prosecuted." And the piece de resistance, a small, handmade sign on the garage door that declared, "Trespassers will be greeted by Grandma. You won't like it." It was half a joke, but mostly a serious warning. Grandma's military background gave her a sharp edge that even Rick couldn't ignore. I felt a flicker of hope, knowing that the woman who raised me was ready to protect our home with everything she had. Even so, the atmosphere in the neighborhood grew heavier. Rumors swirled of neighbors receiving similar inspection notices, some even reporting strangers lurking on their property. Rick's grip tightened, and the HOA board became less a community group and more a task force bent on enforcing his vision by any means necessary. Friends and acquaintances I trusted started avoiding my house, afraid of being caught up in the escalating conflict. But Grandma and I stood our ground, our little fortress of resistance against the creeping darkness of control. One evening, as we sat reviewing footage on the laptop, a new shadow appeared. This time, it wasn't just Rick lurking outside. There were others with him, menacing figures who didn't belong in a quiet suburban street. They moved with purpose, cutting through the side gate and advancing toward the garage. My hands clenched the mouse, heart pounding in my chest. Grandma's face went stone cold. "This is it," she said quietly. "They're crossing the line." We sat in tense silence, waiting for the inevitable. That night was a turning point. We weren't just fighting an overzealous HOA president anymore. We were defending our home, our rights, and the life we had built together. And Grandma was ready. She always had been. The morning air was thick with an uneasy stillness, the kind that seems to hold its breath before a storm breaks loose. I was at work, miles away from home, when the peace of our quiet suburban street shattered. Grandma was alone in the house, comfortably settled in her favorite armchair, fingers deftly weaving yarn in a rhythmic pattern of crochet stitches. The sun filtered through the lace curtains, casting soft shadows across the living room. The faint hum of a distant lawn mower mixed with the occasional chirp of birds. Then, unexpectedly, a sharp, metallic screech sliced through the calm. The unmistakable sound of someone forcing open a lock. It was the side gate, the one we had bolted and double-checked every night, now being brutally cut with bolt cutters. Grandma's knitting needles stilled, her keen ears picking up the telltale crunch of metal giving way. Her eyes narrowed, knitting forgotten in her lap as she rose with a purposeful calmness. In the garage, Rick Withers and two of his so-called security volunteers moved with the practiced ease of men who believed they were entitled to this moment. They had come prepared, wielding bolt cutters, a dolly, and will locks, tools designed to make towing a vehicle as effortless as possible. Their faces were set with a combination of determination and arrogance. The garage door, usually firmly locked, was now being pried open, the heavy steel reluctant but yielding to their effort. Every creak echoed like a gunshot in Grandma's ears. But what Rick and his men did not anticipate was the presence of Grandma herself, standing steady in the threshold of the garage, a striking figure of unexpected resistance. Her small frame belied the strength in her hands, and in one, she gripped a wooden cane, worn smooth by years of use but no less effective as a weapon. In the other hand, she brandished a taser, her fingers curling around it with the familiarity of a soldier ready for combat. "Step away from the vehicle," she said, her voice calm yet unyielding, carrying the weight of authority that no HOA president had ever earned. Rick's response was a derisive laugh, the kind that betrays a man who thinks he holds all the power. But the moment that laughter left his lips, Grandma acted with the speed and precision of a trained veteran. The taser buzzed to life, sending a jolt of electricity into the first volunteer's body. He collapsed in a heap, convulsing and groaning on the cold concrete floor. The second man, startled and disoriented, made a desperate dash for the exit, only to be met with the sharp swing of Grandma's cane. The blow landed with a satisfying crack, and he stumbled, clutching his ribs as he crumpled to the ground. Rick stood frozen, caught between shock and fury, unable to advance or retreat. "This is assault," Rick barked, his voice cracking as he tried to regain control of a situation slipping rapidly beyond his grasp. "You're trespassing." Grandma's gaze was steady, unflinching. "No," she said firmly. "This is defense, and you're trespassing." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, a declaration that the era of intimidation was over. Meanwhile, the neighbors, awakened by the commotion, began gathering at a safe distance. Some dialed their phones. Others peered cautiously from behind curtains and fences. The tension was electric. Moments later, the unmistakable wail of police sirens cut through the morning stillness, growing louder as patrol cars pulled up in front of the house. Officers leapt from their vehicles, their presence a long-awaited beacon of authority and order. The police quickly took control of the scene, their radios crackling with calls for backup as they secured the perimeter. I arrived shortly after, having been contacted by a concerned neighbor who had spotted the activity and called me at work. Breathless, I stepped through the front door to find Grandma standing tall despite the adrenaline, her eyes bright and unyielding. The officers carefully interviewed everyone involved, including Rick and his volunteers, who were now subdued and handcuffed. The footage from the security cameras was immediately reviewed. The clear video showed the bolt cutters slicing through the side gate lock, the forced opening of the garage door, and the confrontation with Grandma every moment captured in crisp detail. The backup SD cards we had stored securely were handed over to the police, ensuring that no evidence could be contested or dismissed. Rick's defense crumbled under the weight of indisputable evidence. His claims that HOA rules permitted him to seize private property without due process were met with disbelief and firm corrections from the officers. It was made clear that the HOA had no legal authority to enter my property without permission, a warrant, or a court order. The officers read Rick his rights and placed him under arrest, the arrogance drained from his face as the reality of his actions settled in. The two volunteers were also taken into custody for their roles in the break-in and assault. The community's collective shock gave way to a surge of support for Grandma and me. Neighbors approached cautiously but warmly, thanking us for standing up to Rick and restoring a sense of justice. The following days were a whirlwind of legal consultations, police reports, and media inquiries. Rick's arrest became the talk of the neighborhood and beyond. The local news stations caught wind of the story, fascinated by the image of a determined grandmother defending her property against HOA bullies. Interviews were arranged, and Grandma, surprisingly media-savvy despite her years, spoke eloquently about standing up for what's right and protecting one's home and family. The narrative was no longer just about a car or a garage. It had become a symbol of resistance against abuse of power and the importance of community solidarity. Legal battles loomed on the horizon, with Rick and his supporters vowing to fight back, but the momentum had shifted decisively. As the dust settled, Grandma and I found ourselves back in our living room, the steady rhythm of her crochet needle soothing the tension still lingering in the air. We reflected on the events with a mixture of relief and resolve. We knew that vigilance was still necessary. Rick's actions had shown how quickly ordinary disputes could escalate when authority was wielded without accountability. But we also understood that our courage had inspired others, that standing firm had the power to change the narrative. Our home was safe once more, a sanctuary not just from physical intrusion, but from the corrosive influence of fear and intimidation. And though the battle was far from over, we were ready for whatever challenges lay ahead, fortified by the unbreakable bond of family and the unyielding spirit of justice. The weeks that followed the dramatic break-in and arrest of Rick Withers marked the beginning of a grueling but ultimately triumphant chapter in our lives. The initial relief that the police had intervened and Rick was in custody quickly gave way to the reality of the legal battles looming ahead. Charges were formally filed: trespassing, attempted theft, and destruction of property. But as with all things tangled in HOA politics, the path to justice was anything but straightforward. The HOA board scrambled to distance themselves from Rick, issuing a carefully worded statement that he had acted outside the scope of his authority, and that his actions did not reflect the values of the community. It was a transparent attempt to protect the organization's reputation while quietly disowning the man who had become the face of their overreach. But beneath their denials, the truth was far more disturbing. During discovery, it emerged that Rick had been manipulating and falsifying HOA documents for months to justify his personal vendettas against me and other residents who dared challenge his rule. He had forged signatures, altered meeting minutes, and even created bogus emergency resolutions, granting him sweeping powers that no legitimate vote had ever approved. This revelation sent shockwaves through the community and provided undeniable evidence that Rick's crusade was not about protecting neighborhood standards, but about exercising unchecked personal tyranny. Grandma was central to our case, not just as a witness but as a force of nature. Despite her age, she navigated the complex legal proceedings with the sharpness and calm of a seasoned prosecutor. When she took the stand, her testimony was both precise and compelling. She recounted every detail of the break-in. From the moment she heard the bolt cutters on the gate to the electric shock she delivered with her taser and the swift swing of her cane that brought one of the intruders down. Her words painted a vivid picture of courage and determination, demonstrating not only her right to defend her property, but the reckless aggression Rick had shown. She even brought a tray of homemade cookies for the bailiff and court staff, softening the sterile courtroom atmosphere with warmth and kindness. Her presence was impossible to ignore, graceful, dignified, yet fierce. The judge, an experienced and no-nonsense woman, described Grandma as a model citizen with the spirit of a lioness during her closing remarks. The courtroom erupted in applause after Grandma finished her testimony, the sound echoing through the hushed chamber like a victory bell. The outcome of the trial was decisive. Rick was found guilty on all charges, his attempts to mask his actions under a veneer of HOA authority shredded by the evidence. The judge ordered restitution for the damaged side gate, awarded compensation for the emotional distress and property damage we had suffered, and imposed hefty fines. Rick was banned from the community permanently, his name effectively erased from the HOA rolls, and he faced additional penalties for his fraudulent document tampering. The HOA itself, although initially reluctant, was held liable for failing to supervise and control their rogue president, and we filed a countersuit seeking damages for the turmoil and costs they had inflicted on us and other residents. The court sided with us emphatically, ordering the HOA to pay legal fees, replace the destroyed gate with a sturdier, more secure model, and institute reforms designed to prevent future abuses of power. It was a landmark victory that sent a clear message. No one, not even an HOA president, was above the law. In the weeks after the court's decision, our neighborhood began to heal and rebuild. The community meetings that once felt like arenas of hostility were now spaces of genuine dialogue and cooperation. Many neighbors expressed gratitude for our stand, admitting they had felt powerless against Rick's reign, but inspired by Grandma's fearless defense. She quickly became a local legend, with neighbors dropping by our house to shake her hand, seek advice on home defense, or simply hear the story firsthand. We even installed a new sign outside the garage that read, in bold letters, "Guarded by Grandma, trespassers will be shamed, tased, and defeated." It was a tongue-in-cheek but fitting tribute to her heroic stand, and it quickly became a neighborhood landmark, a symbol of resilience and the power of standing up for one's rights. Through it all, Grandma remained as humble and down-to-earth as ever. When asked how she felt about the attention and accolades, she would just smile and say, "I did what any of us would do if our home and family were threatened." Her spirit was infectious, a reminder that courage isn't about size or age, but about conviction and heart. And as for the Chevelle, it remained exactly as it had been, untouched, pristine, a shining testament to our victory and our refusal to be bullied. I learned a vital lesson that no amount of intimidation could break the bond between family and the resolve to protect what matters most. The HOA learned, too, that overreach and abuse of power would be met with fierce resistance. Our story became a cautionary tale, a legend whispered in HOA meetings and neighborhood barbecues about the day a grandma stood up and won against the odds. In the end, justice was served not just in the courtroom but in the hearts of all who witnessed the fight. Grandma's courage became a beacon, lighting the way for others who might one day face similar battles. And while the scars from Rick's actions would linger, so too would the lessons we learned, lessons about standing firm, speaking out, and never underestimating the quiet strength of family. Our home was more than just a place. It was a fortress built on love, resilience, and the unwavering spirit of a grandmother who refused to be pushed around. As the sun set over our peaceful street, the Chevelle gleamed in the driveway, guarded by a warrior's legacy and the promise that no one would ever break in again.